Hello and welcome to On the Table. My name's Rebecca and this is Rachel and Corie, and today we're going to be reviewing a book by Nabeel Qureshi called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Now, before we jump right into that, we're going to do a quick icebreaker question for the two of you guys. So, which book, other than the Bible, has left the most lasting impression on you? And I know you guys probably have lists, you probably have more than one book, but which book do you guys think would have the most lasting impression on you?
Rachel, do you want to go first? Because this is really difficult.
You're going to take a really long time with this. Okay, I can't even remember the name of the book off the top of my head. There was a work of fiction that I read. It has to be almost 10 years ago now, that whenever I think of like my favorite book, that's the one that comes to mind, and I cannot even remember the name of it at all.
So it's okay.
So the story left an impression.
Yeah,
the book name didn't.
That
I think it's something love. Wow, that's not helpful at all. It's like every book, and it is something of a love story, but it's taken out of scripture, and that's probably it. Cool. And otherwise, I think there's probably Ravi Zacharias. Pretty much anything that he writes.
He's a good author.
It sticks with me for a long time. I really like his stuff.
Yeah, I've never actually read a book by Ravi Zacharias before.
You should.
I've heard him talk a lot, obviously, and his sermons are amazing. But
they are.
I feel like that needs to be put on my bucket list of things to do, is a book by him.
Yeah, they're quite good.
Yeah. What about you, Corie?
Okay, so I have categorized this in my brain in
This is going to be the podcast.
Okay, no, I'll be quick. I've categorized it into general age groups for me. So when I was a kid, when I was in kindergarten, I'm going somewhere with this, I swear. I read a book for kids on Egyptology.
Okay.
And that spoke and sung to my 5-year-old heart.
That's adorable.
And I fell in love with
cute.
Egypt and archaeology from that. So that was, I think, like that's what I do now. I research journalism.
So it's clearly
I was half expecting her to say Dr. Seuss and then list every book she's ever read.
How far back are we going?
No. Okay, and then teenage years. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
That was a really good
book. Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell.
Really good one.
And then in my adult years, I would say the two most influential authors, I think, have been Gary Habermas with his historical Jesus.
Okay, I've never actually heard of him before.
So he does a lot of work on the resurrection of Christ as a historical event.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
And taking evidence that the most skeptical scholar accepts as true, and showing how the gospel still comes out of that. And then Craig Blomberg, Professor Craig Blomberg, and many of his books and commentaries.
I'm going through one of his right now, and it's quite good.
Exciting.
Yeah.
It's
So see, that didn't take that long.
That's not too bad. I guess we'll give it to you. You can list like 10 books instead of one. No big deal. Well, if I had to pick one, like the question's asked, mine would probably be Case for Christ by Lee Strobel.
That's a really
Just
good
because
one.
it was like the first one where it was like, this is how you can defend your Christianity and your beliefs to other people.
Yeah.
Which, again, going right into this book, I actually thought this book did a really good job of that as well.
Yeah.
So we're going to be jumping into that.
Okay.
So a quick couple things about the author. So Nabeel Qureshi, he's author of the New York Times bestseller, No God But One, and Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, which is the book we're going to be reviewing today.
Right.
It's the only book to ever win Christian Book Awards for both Best New Author and Best Nonfiction. So Nabeel was raised as a devout Muslim in the United States. He grew up studying Islamic apologetics with his family and engaging Christians in religious discussions. After one such discussion with a Christian, the two became friends and began a years-long debate on the historical claims of Christianity and Islam. Throughout the years of his ministry, Nabeel lectured to students at more than 100 universities, which to me is just astounding. That's really cool, including Oxford, Columbia, Dartmouth, Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Hong Kong. He participated in 18 moderated public debates around North America, Europe, and Asia. Christianity Today heralded Nabeel as one of 33 under 33 in its cover story on emerging religious leaders back in July of 2014. His other works include Answering Jihad, which is actually a book that I've just picked up but haven't read yet.
I have read that one.
So I'm excited about that. A Balanced Examination of Jihad, The Rise of ISIS and Islamic Terrorism, and the Seeking Allah Finding Jesus video study, which goes deeper into the apologetics that led Nabeel himself to Christ and no God but one, Allah or Jesus, the follow-up to Seeking Allah Finding Jesus. Following a year-long battle with stomach cancer, heaven welcomed Nabeel home on September 16th, 2017. He leaves behind a wife and his young daughter who aspire to honor him in the ministerial legacy that Nabeel has established during his brief 34 years on the earth. So that's a little bit about Nabeel. Now a little bit on the book for you guys. In this book, Nabeel Qureshi describes his dramatic journey from Islam to Christianity through friendships, investigations, and even supernatural dreams. He provides an intimate look into his loving Muslim home and shares how he developed a passion for Islam before discovering evidence for Jesus, rising from the dead, claiming to be God. Unable to deny the arguments, but not wanting to deny his family, Qureshi struggled with an inner turmoil that will challenge all of those who are interested in the world's greatest religions. So that's a little bit about the book, a little bit about the author, and now we're just going to go through some questions, kind of discuss what we thought as we were reading this.
Yeah.
So, and kind of go from there.
Okay.
So first one, since this is a story about his life, Nabeel's life, what did you most take away from his life? What was one thing in the book that kind of stood out to you guys that you were like, yes, this was a really, interesting piece of his life?
That's a good question.
There are a few. I think I noticed, and he even full out says it, that effective evangelism requires relationship, and that's really demonstrated throughout the entirety of this book.
It is.
That is very true.
Because he spent so much time, like he comes from a family that was very devout, and they knew their stuff.
Yeah.
And so when he would interact, being an American, with other faiths, he would interact with them and he would challenge them on their own beliefs. And so there's instances in the book where he goes through and describes talking to a Christian and challenging them on why Jesus is not God.
Yeah.
And he challenges them and saw himself as a missionary for Islam.
Yeah.
And what brought him ultimately to Christ was the search, the looking and the seeking through relationships with his very good friend, who was a believer. And I think that what stands out to me the most is just that evangelism is not effective as much without that relationship with people.
Yeah.
And I think every Christian can take that home and go, that's how you evangelize. That's how you win.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately it is the Holy Spirit, but you can't do that without relationship.
It's very true.
Yeah.
Earning that right to speak into someone's life.
Exactly.
Yeah, for them to actually take you seriously and get mad at you, but still care about what you said.
Yeah.
That
and
has
so
to
come
have a
back
relationship.
to that.
Yeah, you have
come back.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. And it's interesting that you brought up the point about him kind of like being a missionary for Islam, because one of the things I actually learned about Islam, I was like, I don't know that much about it, not gonna lie to you. So this is one of the first books I've ever read that actually really deals with it, which was really eye-opening for me. But his grandfather was a missionary for Islam. That's how his mother grew up. They lived in India for a long time, and they were Muslim missionaries. Same with his great-grandfather. Like, he comes from a very long line of Muslim missionaries, which is interesting to me because I didn't even realize that Muslims had missionaries, but it makes perfect sense, right? Like, if you think about it.
Yeah,
so I thought that was really interesting, and that's why he felt so compelled to not only know exactly what his faith stood for, but to go on and kind of preach that, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
What really stood out to me was just how patient God was in this whole thing, because it took Nabeel a very long time, which makes sense. But to be able to see, he very carefully and I think artfully wove that into his story, and he recognized that as well. Like, look at here how God was so patient with me and gave me the answers that I need, and you see, I think too, like, just seeing God respond so gracefully to Nabeel, who was honestly searching for the truth, but taking a really long time to get there because he's human and he comes from a background that is so not Christian. That there was so many layers that had to be dealt with and questions that had to be answered for him to finally go, okay.
Yeah, and to be able to give that up.
Well, he wasn't even just dealing with the difference between Christianity and Islam. He's also dealing with the difference between a Western upbringing, because he was born here.
He was born in the United States.
In the United States, but his family, his culture is very different, and he goes through that and talking about the difference between like our guilt innocence culture versus honor shame culture, which is what they come from, and that's something I've never really understood, and he explains it quite well. And now you kind of, having read this, I have a deeper understanding of a very different culture that lives next to my culture in my own country. And I really appreciate that.
It was a really good perspective, and one that we don't often get. As being part of our
was my
culture.
first.
I had never, and you know, it made me so much more aware of the people around me and much more compassionate. And I think that was a surprise that I wasn't expecting out of the book, to just completely go, oh, I understand now. And I think that is a big triumph of this book.
Big time.
I definitely agree
with you guys there too. All right, so kind of along those lines, was there something especially surprising to you about Nabeel's life story? Because he kind of does go through quite a bit of his childhood in here. Was there any like one event or one thing that kind of stood out to you guys that was like, wow, I really wasn't expecting this? Or
Yes. Okay, so without spoiling too much, because you absolutely should read this book if you haven't. Nabeel experiences a supernatural dream.
Okay, this was the same piece for me.
And event. And
that's where I was going.
God uses Nabeel's culture and current religion in that dream to tell him the truth about Christ and about who he is.
Which is amazing.
That blew my mind. That, like, because, you know, God is so cool that he would, and we know in theory that God does that God approaches you in your own culture and he speaks to you in a way that you'll understand. That's just who God, we know that intellectually.
And like we even use Christianese words for that, like God's gonna meet you where you're at. We always say that, right? Like God's gonna meet you where you're at, and that's the Christianese version of it.
It's so true.
Anyway, keep going.
But to have an example of that in an Islamic culture is so cool. But how do you speak against it?
Because he had several dreams, and even before he, like earlier on, he has a vision. And for me that was because he's praying to God, and he's not praying at the time that he has his vision. He's not praying to the God of the Bible. He's praying to Allah. And God answers. And shows him, like gives him his answer in such a profound way that he could not deny that there was a God. And that later became really important when he really started to question everything, and his whole worldview was starting to fall apart. And it was really interesting to see how God was with him the whole time and just like took him through it a step at a time. And that was really what a testimony of our God, of our God's love for him, that he would take him through it that slowly, because he does that with everyone.
And don't you think that as Western Christians, it can be, I think a common Western Christian problem is that we like to go, okay, this is the way things are. And we like to explain the world and explain God and explain Christianity like this. And anything outside the box, we're like, oh, I don't know about that.
We will go to church on Sunday and meet God. Right there.
And so when you're confronted with a testimony that goes outside of the box of your normal thinking, I think that's incredibly instructive and a good thing for your brain to remember, right, I'm not God. God can operate outside of the bounds of
my
what
rules.
I think. My rules.
Which I think is so interesting too. And there were so many different times, even in the book, with the evidence that he was using or the evidence that he was gathering, that it made me so ignorant. Like, it showed me just how ignorant to Islam I think sometimes our culture can be. And especially like in the places when you're not confronted with it every day. But like for me, this is the first time I've even heard like a Christian debate against Islam. Like I've never even researched into that. And I was
Right.
like, it's so obvious that the evidence for Christianity would win. And I feel like deep down inside we know that. And we know that like historically, even outside of biblical texts, historically, obviously,
Yes.
Corie, as you would know too, there's so much evidence for Christianity. And that's talked about quite a bit in this book. And to me, I was like, of course, other books like the Quran and all these other things don't have the same evidence because it's not, it can't stand up to the same test because it's not inspired by God and it's not protected by God and it's not the one truth that there is. So for me, that was actually something so staggering because I always think of like, you know, debating a Muslim or something as absolutely terrifying because I'm like, you know, often you just hear really good arguments for them because that's sort of what comes up in pop culture or those kinds of things. Whereas with this book, I thought he just broke it down so nicely.
Yeah.
And he
And
did
it
it
took
really
time.
respectfully. Yeah.
It,
does
it
take time.
took him a lot of time to break down his problems with Christianity and the arguments against it and kind of look at, well, this is the problem, like this is what Islam teaches about Jesus. Why is that not true? And it took him years ultimately.
He goes over 3 things in this book mainly. One, is Jesus God? And 2, did Jesus die? 3, did he raise from the dead? And he uses the verse in Romans 10, verse 9, how you have to confess with your mouth that Jesus is God, believe that he died and rose again. And that's the verse that he now uses. And he's like, when you believe these things, now that he evangelizes for Christianity, and then he kind of goes from there, which I thought was really interesting. But it was interesting because he also compares it to the 5 pillars of Islam with it as well, which again, like he breaks down quite nicely. So it was really neat. All right. Did you guys have any preconceived opinions of him that changed after reading his story? If so, was it a change for the better or for worse?
I didn't really know what he was all about, honestly. I had heard him speak a few times and I really liked him, but I didn't look into his history at all or his past at all. I thought he must, I was very impressed being so young that he spoke so clearly and articulate and well. So when I read his book, I was blown away even more. I was just very, very impressed. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he was named one of the 33 under 33.
No, at all. No, not at all.
No.
Doesn't surprise me in the least.
No, not at all. I think for me, because I did a little bit of research and I had looked into what he was doing. Before I read this book, I read Answering Jihad, and I really enjoyed that. Because I had a debate with somebody about jihad. We were discussing it, and I was like, you know what, I really don't know enough about this, so I'm going to find a book, and I found his book. And so that's why I wanted to read this one, because after reading that one, I thought, I need to read all of his other books.
Where he came from.
But, so I was expecting something, I was expecting a lot, and I was not at all disappointed. It was one of those things where I expected a lot from this book, and every new chapter, every time my husband came into the room while I was reading, I'm like, you have to read this book. This is non-negotiable. Of all the books I've told you to read,
to my husband
you don't have to read those. You have to read this one. Like that was just, it impacted me that one. So maybe that should be my answer to your question about the most important book. This one is definitely, this one was really, it was really up there. It really stands out to me, and like I have to highly recommend it. So for that.
For sure, I would agree. All right. Did Nabeel cover both sides of the argument between Islam and Christianity fairly?
I think he did. I think he did.
I'm on the same page as
because
that.
he went into it as a skeptic.
Yes.
Like he went in and he starts with, this is what I believed, this is why I believed it, this is what I didn't believe and why I didn't believe it, and he takes you through his story. And it's not, this book's not really a debate back and forth, because it is, but you know where he's going. But he does a really good job of explaining both sides and then explaining what convinced him ultimately. And it wasn't easy, because leaving Islam is not an easy thing to do. It did cost him everything.
It does.
It really did. And he said that it was worth it. And I believe him.
And he still stands by
And
that.
and
he did up and
he always stood by that. But because it wasn't easy to convince himself, I think you can say that it was fair. It was definitely
I
fair.
would agree with that. And I think one of my favorite quotes from the book that I underlined was, "The arguments and apologetics for Christianity tore down those barriers, positioning me to make a decision to pursue God or not." And this is before he actually becomes a Christian. But I think it's a really good way of explaining sort of like the entire first half of this book, because he goes through step by step with his friend David and breaks down all these arguments for Christianity and all these things he's held in place. And he does a really good job really thinking about it reasonably, putting aside his culture, putting aside kind of his past, and going with really open eyes, which I really appreciated and respected as well. But I thought it was interesting because after he had the arguments and the apologetics, he still had to come to a heart decision. And for me, that was one of the most pivotal points in the book. I'm like bawling my eyes out as I was reading it, because to me, I was like, the amount that he has to give up for his culture, and the amount that his culture is ingrained in him. Like, they learn Arabic before English most of the time when they're in the US, because they don't translate the Quran. They learn it in the original language, which again was something I didn't know. Like, I learned so much from reading this. But I thought he did such a fair job in being like, even though I know mentally that this is right, that Christianity is true, he's like, the other piece of it, like, it's still weeks and weeks and weeks till he actually comes to Christianity, because of everything he's giving up, and because of the difference with the cultures, which you were mentioning earlier, with the authoritative culture. Like, it doesn't get any worse for Muslim families than it does if they leave, especially to Christianity. And then for him to extend that choice, which he very briefly talks about at the end, to go on and work with Rabbi Zacharias Ministries and these Acts 17 ministries.
Full career change.
It's a total career change. He was studying to be a doctor. He became a doctor with several masters in several different things, because he's very smart. But to me, that was so staggering and amazing that, you know, you can know everything mentally and you can argue mentally, but that's why it's such an amazing thing with Christianity is you need the Spirit of God. And that has to be there when you're making a decision to follow Christ, which is so neat.
It really is.
Yeah. So it's really neat.
Yeah, it's such a cool window into his story.
Yeah, and to see it with eyes that we would never be able to see it with either.
Yes.
Because we don't come from that background and are not as involved probably as others, which I thought was really interesting. So that was really neat. So he wrote a few other books, including one called No God But One, Allah or Jesus, which has more facts and arguments that he learned over the years. Would you read it after reading this book?
Definitely.
Yes.
I definitely would.
I'm almost disappointed in myself that I haven't ordered it and read it already.
Good for you.
It's on the list. It's on my to-do list.
I haven't read it yet. But no, absolutely I would. And in fact, I would recommend doing it, and for this book too, obviously.
Yeah, because not only was he clearly a very talented author, the book is extremely engaging.
Yes, easy to read.
It's structured very well. But through him telling his story, he conveys his heart. And his heart and his motivations are really good. So I would have no hesitation whatsoever reading another one of his books or recommending.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. And one last question. Was there anything about the Islamic faith that really stood out to you? And I know we sort of talked about that a little bit, but was there anything specific that was kind of shocking for you guys, or something you didn't know yet? Or
there was a lot that I didn't know yet.
Me too. Honestly, there was probably everything.
There were a few things that I was familiar with, but I don't think that I really understood them very well until I read the book and understood, because he explains everything through story, through examples of what happened, and you see illustrations of his life when it comes to relationships, marrying someone outside of the faith, and kind of the culture differences in between, and how Islam is tied very much into culture. There were things like that I just didn't quite grasp, that having read this, there were so many times where I was like, oh, I get it now.
Yes.
Like, that makes so much more sense now.
Interactions,
yes.
like from like the old culture to the newer
the
Western culture.
Yeah.
That clashing of cultures, never really understood. Tried to understand it, but then seeing it from his perspective, stuck in the middle, as the child of an immigrant family, trained in the ways of the West,
in the West,
but still having a home life that's from the East. Really interesting.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Instructive. I can't even choose just one. There's so many.
There's
so
a lot.
many things.
Yeah.
I would agree with you. I think one of the things that stood out to me about the Islamic faith, and I knew this to an extent, but not all the way, is their dedication to their faith.
Yep.
If half the Christians in Canada or the U.S.
Seriously.
had dedication to their
He's
faith,
praying 5 times
like-
a day, which is common
and they
if
always
you're dedicated.
do, and in a different language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like everything they do is for Islam. Absolutely
Yeah.
everything. The choices they make, what they wear, what they eat, everything
Yeah.
is for Islam. And I thought, like, for me, that was so staggering because I was like, I realized that they were like that certain
Yeah.
sects of being of the Islamic faith are more devout than others, but I didn't realize how even like some of the most basic ones are so intense and it's so ingrained in them and they're so devoted and they stay devoted. And part of that is because I think of the authority culture that they have.
Definitely.
But
Yes. Yep.
to me, I was like, how sad is it that Christians today, we can say, you know, we go to church on Christmas and Easter and that's good enough and that's all it has to be. And not that all Christians are like that,
No,
obviously.
that's very much a cultural
It's very much a
Christian.
cultural
There is a
Christian.
difference between-
There is. But to
but-
me, I thought that was so staggering because, like, honestly, if half the Christians where we are and the people that we know who
Yeah.
actually claim to be Christians lived even half as good as Muslim kids do, it would just be staggering, I think, the difference. And their commitment to their faith is so amazing.
Yeah.
And I think it also makes it so much harder to break out of it because it is so ingrained in what you're doing and who you are. But for me, that was one of the most fascinating things, for sure, to be reading about that.
Yeah.
And then to see his arguments kind of and his reasoning about, you know, how hard it is to leave that. But then the fact that he still does choose to leave that to me is quite staggering.
Yeah.
And was really interesting because even when he had converted, there had been like just a month or two before, there had been a family that was killed for leaving the Islamic faith. That was really quite close to him. I think it was in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And even that, like, it's like almost just a reminder of what could happen because
Yeah.
still in the States that does happen
does.
in Canada, which
It
I thought
does.
was staggering.
Yeah.
It's
So
wild. Yeah.
that to me was one of the biggest things that like I was kind of blown away by it because I knew it to an extent, but not as much. So,
Yeah.
Really interesting.
What about you?
Yeah. No, I'm pretty much
Kinda
disagreeing. I'm
everything?
like, yes. I honestly
Yes to
can't
all.
pinpoint. Yeah.
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 There was a lot of his, the reasons for kind of his faith changing. And one of the ones I think that stood out to me for his reasoning for Christianity was when he was talking about the Son of Man and how Jesus claims to be the Son of Man. And is that actually a claim of being God and being a deity and those kinds of things? And to me, like I had heard it before, but not in the same perspective and not in the importance
Yes.
as it was. Because kind of growing up in it, you sort of just take it and you're like, yeah, John 1 explains it and we're
Yeah.
good here. But then when he brings up, you know, Mark
Yeah.
14, verse 62, and he brings that up in relation to Daniel 7, I was
Daniel.
like,
Wait
it was
a
like
second.
mind blown.
Yeah, it makes.
Yeah.
It
I was
makes
really
a lot of
impressed
sense.
with
Yeah.
that. So, yeah. Any concluding statements that you'd like to make on that, or
okay,
anything else you'd like to add?
Just one thing.
Yeah.
For this book, when we ordered this one and started reading it, this is
Yes.
the second edition. So before, we didn't have access to the third edition. So now if you want to go on and get this book, you can get the third edition. And it's different. It's a memorial edition. So it's, and it was released last month in August. And so it's expanded to include additional behind-the-scenes stories told by his good friend David Wood, reflections on his life and legacy by his wife, and an afterword by his mentor, Mark Middleburg. So there's just a little bit more. It has a different cover. So if you are interested in getting this book, which I recommend,
Which we all recommend.
completely
You definitely-
recommend.
Yes.
This has to be on your reading list.
Yeah.
It has
It does.
to. Yeah.
you can get the updated version, which I have not read, but I would recommend because it'll be the same, but there's more stuff in
But
it.
just
so.
more
Yeah.
things, which is all I want from this book is more of it.
I know.
So, yeah.
So no God but one. You have to
Yes.
add that to your list then, because that'll have more of the arguments
Yeah,
and stuff.
for
Yes.
sure. Which was cool, yeah, because I bought the one that answering
Jihad.
jihad, so I
Yep.
still have to read that one, but I'm excited. I'm
Which
excited
is
to
really
learn
good.
more about it
It
too.
also is really good.
Yeah,
I really
it'll be
enjoyed
great.
it.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else from you?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. You should read it.
Definitely add this one to your
Totally.
list. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today on the table. And again, pick up this book. You can go to christianbook.com or wherever you get your books, Amazon, anywhere really. And we hope that you guys join us next time. Thanks so much. Thank you for joining the discussion we've thrown on the table today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, you can give us a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest content from Bible Discovery TV. You can also find On the Table on Facebook with our latest episodes and some bonus content.